Welcome. Thank you for coming. One of the things that I find interesting personally, and I usually tell everybody when we do these, that really these conversations are very selfish for me to get to know somebody a little bit better. And also for my own path, all of us begin somewhere, and what we end up doing in our lives, often a manifestation of what has occurred or happened to us early in our lives. And I know you have mentioned the different forums. You've talked about your grandmother and other events that connected you, if you will, with dying. I know that, I guess in the article it said your then husband did work, I guess in the 70s on the use of LSD and palliative care, which I find fascinating. Maybe we can talk about that. And then now on your more recent books about dying and being fearless, if you will, or cultivating compassion in these conversations with people who are dying. So maybe you can start with sort of your earliest, and then we'll head towards the wild child of the 60s.
I'm thinking specifically about...
Now remember, let's get back to this.
You know, I was saying that there was something that happened to me, a serious illness when I was a child, when I woke up at the age of 4. I didn't wake up in terms of enlightenment. I actually was in darkened. I couldn't see. And and I was very, very sick for several years. And I will say that this had two astonishing effects on me. One was that it brought my attention in retrospect to the fact that I had an inner life. You know, when you aren't digesting the world visually, your imagination, your mental processes turn inward. And you're recreating the world, since you were sighted before, as a internal visual experience. And so in retrospect, I saw that, but it was really shaping my experience of the value of having an inner life. There were actually 2 more pieces, Jim, that I think are interesting to mention because, you know, my first Zen teacher, he used to say, good karma is bad karma, and bad karma is good karma. So, you know, I was in this difficulty as a child, but it actually ended up being a really good situation. And the second stream of that was the fact that my parents brought in an Afro-American woman to take care of me, whose mother had been a slave. That shows you how old I am.
Now you were in Georgia.
I was actually in southern Florida at this time. And her spirit, her strength, her lack of self-pity, her capacity for joy really got to me. But there was another quality which moved across the threshold of my psyche, and that was her dignity. I mean, the absolute dignity with which it wasn't that she was distal, she was extremely warm, but she had phenomenal dignity in spite of her economic and social circumstances. And she lit my life. She really did. And the third stream had to do with my status as a person who was sick. And that was to be something, you know, that I followed for the, you know, here I am 70, I'll be 71 this summer, and I followed it, this thread, my whole life. And that is, can you, out of the experience of deep physical illness, develop strength? And I concluded, yes. I concluded that as an anthropologist, I saw this in rites of passage, where individuals were subjected to extremely rigorous experiences that were, you know, kind of taking them to the edge, and where they either went over the edge or they developed character. or people who were gravely ill, who managed to somehow navigate their way through the illness, not through denial or excluding themselves from the truth of their suffering, but actually it became a platform for compassion. And it reminded me something that Desmond Tutu said of Nelson Mandela that was really interesting. He said, you know, Nelson lacked empathy before he went to prison. And when I heard that, I realized that I had actually had the honor of presencing many people over the years whose lives had cracked open in the midst of catastrophe, and who became bigger and better, deeper, more authentic people as a result of the suffering that they passed through. Yeah, so those are three streams, you know, that stirred me. And then, you know, Jim, so when I got more able, more out there, still a very young person, I identified with situations, I felt very comfortable with situations that were characterized by futility. You know, I mean, it's kind of funny thing to say, but you know, whether it was the civil rights movement, where, for example, in the 60s, I can tell you, in my wildest dreams, I never thought we would see an Afro-American president in the course of my lifetime, even though I'm not in accord with quite a bit that he's engaged in, excuse me. I never thought the environment would be so compromised. That's another thing. I mean, you know, I thought that we were on a trajectory that was more positive than we're in the process of right now. I never thought when I was a very young person that I would end up feeling incredibly nourished, not only by working with dying people, but by also working in the prison system, where I was a volunteer for 6 years in death row and maximum security in the penitentiary of New Mexico. But it's in these conditions of hopelessness that one often discovers something about the human spirit that is not available so much for, you know, people who are privileged in the way that we are.
Well, it gets back to your quote. I mean, on some level, many of us hope or wish we have a different background in the sense of this privileged background, but at the same time, we're thankful for our experiences which resulted in suffering. And in some ways, it's sort of interesting, right? Because we sit there and say, we want to try to relieve as much suffering as possible, but on the other end, we acknowledge suffering, if you will, gives character and depth of experience that makes you feel connected and also gives you incredible lessons about who we are and the human spirit. You comment about your death row experience and that. You know, I've commented on this before, and in fact, I did a blog in the HuffPost about a peripheral aspect of this, which is, you know, we have these prisons filled with people, and in fact, in the U.S., you know, we have the largest number of incarcerated individuals of any industrialized country. Yet I submit to you, and as I've said, most of these people are not bad people. It is not as if there's some evilness that's happening. For many of these people, what has happened in their lives and has brought them to that point is actually a lack of love, kindness, and somebody caring for them. And I'm sure maybe you can give us some examples, your own experience, when you show someone dignity, a respect for their humanity.
Yeah, this was definitely my experience of working, quotes, inside. I remember the first day I was invited to do this work by a wonderful psychologist named Laurel Caraher, who was kind of a very sensitive, and at the point she was a student of mine, she said she was just burned out from the work, and would I come and collaborate with her? And I'll never forget. So I had a hair don't, not a hairdo, and we go to the penitentiary, and you have to go through all this stuff. And we walk into the room. It's the foyer, actually, of the psychology department of the, penitentiary. And in walked a dozen guys with their trousers kind of dropped around their hips, and they're wearing hairnets kind of over their heads and eyebrows. And some of them have dark glasses, and they sit in the chairs like this. And I'm like, oh, I think this was not a good decision. I feel really weird. I'm sitting here with my hair down, and I've got, some real characters before me, including men who have tears tattooed on their, sides of their eyes and down their cheeks, representing people they had murdered. And I was scared. I really was threatened by the situation. But I'm kind of a, give it the old college try. And I said, I'd appreciate it if you all would introduce yourselves. So the first guy is dark glasses, and he looks, big scowl on his face, and he says, and I said, I'd love to see your eyes. And he goes, like that. And I said, give me a break. You sort of beg in that situation. And the guy took off his glasses, and we looked at each other's eyes for an instant, and he put his glasses back on. And we went around the circle. And by the time the last guy spoke, he whipped something out of his pocket, and he handed it to me, and it was a hairnet. And I realized I was home. That was cool. I had passed the test, that test. There were some I didn't pass so well either. But, all of my psychosocial concerns about being with males who were murderers and really big guys, not little guys, but about your size, Jim.
Threatening.
Right. It's like, all of my concerns were actually dissolved in this feeling, once I withdrew my projections of just being able to open to these men. And I went into the prison work for two reasons. One is I'd been working in the end-of-life care field since 1970, and I felt more or less deeply comfortable and, able to be with the uncertainty in the dying process, not only with dying people, but also with family caregivers. It's like more familiar territory for me. And I actually wanted to move into another territory where this similar kind of uncertainty was present, but the landscape wasn't quite as familiar. So, it was like I had lost somehow the pulse of what it was to work with dying people. So when I went in and did this 6-year stint in the prison, it really opened up my whole sort of view, it opened up my view of working with dying people. So when I couldn't work in the prison system anymore, I felt like I was really refreshed in terms of the capacity of, fundamental courage, but not brave courage. It's more like humble courage, of being basically deeply interested in how people's lives unfold in the midst of crisis. And also, as I said before, the sense of real wonder and respect about the human spirit. Yeah, something like that.
I don't know if you've done much work with children.
No.
But I did a fellowship in pediatric neurosurgery and used to be the chief of neurosurgery at Children's Hospital. So I would see children who were going to die. Mm. But the extraordinary thing, actually, about children is, though, and I can't tell you the number of times it would happen, a child who...
I'm not sure your mic is...
Oh, it fell down. Can you hear me? Okay. So what I was saying was I trained as a pediatric neurosurgeon, was the chief of neurosurgery at Pediatric Hospital. And one of the things that I experienced, which I actually still find amazing, is children who are dying. And whether it's they don't have the baggage of our life experience or they haven't grown attached, I would have them say, I know I'm going to die. It's okay. But we help my parents. And it was really an amazing experience that these children who have not lived, if you will, but had this great understanding and natural acceptance for what was going to happen to them. But almost invariably, they were concerned about those left behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting experience. But speaking about being left behind.
Let's just take a breath.
No, I do this every time. But getting back to that, I mean, it is extraordinarily painful for some people to watch people dying. And as we're talking, and I'm a neurosurgeon, so I can't do this very often while I'm doing my job, can I? But you see this happen. You see what people go through. Is it an equally challenging situation, though, to be present with those left behind or the person dying? Or do they each have their own sort of flavor, or is it everyone is different and you're just trying to get them through it?
Well, I sit here, in the presence of two palliative care physician friends of mine, Gary and Ken, who do this every day. And so I'm loath to say anything, except I would say that our work, whether our death is imminent or down the line, or whether we're presencing someone who's dying, our work is really to unpack or make grief transparent to ourselves. I think there's so much unexpressed grief in Western culture. And this is not only about the experience of the loss of loved ones or even the loss of capacity. It has in part, I feel, to do with our lack of vision around the truth of impermanence, that everything is going to pass from us. Everything we cherish will eventually be lost from us. Then we want to hold and to fix in place things, and that we're a culture that is basically riven with grief that is unresolved, and all that means. So when a death or a loss is closer in our lives, and that loss is, I'm not speaking about a next of kin. I'm also speaking about the loss of capacity. Not being able to climb the mountain, or not being able to think as easily, or not being able to, bounce up the stairs. These are small cuts, small losses, but very significant in the life of individuals. So in my experience in this field of being with people who are dying, and also caregivers, professional and family caregivers, that there's anticipatory grief that dying people go through in thinking about their own lives and those lives coming to an end. But there's also the anticipatory grief that caregivers go through, professional and family caregivers. And I don't feel I can generalize, Jim, about the nature of grief. For me, grief is a mystery that's equal to death. And each individual where that treasure house is opened up, where we could be intimate around grief, it's been, a unique experience and not so generalizable, in spite of the fact that we want to make a kind of paradigm, say these are the stages or something like that. But I don't think it always operates in ways that you can predict.
Well, I think in some ways it's like what I do. You can read the textbook about doing an operation, but that has no relationship either to the actual operation or the person you're operating on. And everybody has a life that is unique, that requires at least thoughtful, I think, people to recognize that and treat every person as that unique individual. Right. And I think that's the challenge for each of us. Maybe you can talk about this concept of impermanence and attachment and delusion a little bit. And I hate to use those Buddhist terms.
I don't know. That's for a Buddhist talk.
It's though that is a common terminology that's used, but I think for a lot of the people who come here, these are thoughts not so much even in the context of Buddhism. These are now thoughts that are in common use. As an example, we talked about Wisdom 2.0. You see in the media now people talking about mindfulness practice. We see this going throughout the school system. We see many, many people engaged in this, but it's this attachment and this fear of, if you will, what's going to happen.
Change, right. Well, I often say that what we do in meditation at a very deep level is we become an ally to uncertainty. I think it's our desire for certainty that messes a lot of things up. And I like in the Vimalakirti Sutra, Robert Thurman characterized this, I think, in a really wonderful way. He used this term. He says, one must develop a tolerance for the inconceivable. A tolerance for the inconceivable. And then, maybe Suzuki Roshi would call it beginner's mind. So, we're trying to live in a way that is controlling our life, that gives us a sense that, if this happens, this will happen. We try to solidify the ground on which we're standing. But what practice does is just kind of takes the rug and just pulls it out from under you if you drop deep enough into it. And you realize you're in this kind of groundless, completely insecure situation that you can't count on anything. You really can't count on anything. And it frees you up. It terrifies the heck out of you in one way. But in another way, it completely frees you up to be right here in this moment. In the vividness and the absolute sort of surprise or the mystery of it.
Well, it's interesting because, and I know you're familiar with the science, but, we talk about how through our evolution we've developed this recognition of a future, but with future comes uncertainty, of course. And then the other aspect of this is we have a recognition of the past or a memory. And these two things basically stop us from being in the present.
Yeah.
And I think that seems to be one of the biggest challenges.
And yet, I like what Thich Nhat Hanh says. He says, in the present, there's the past and the future. So we're not dissociating from the temporal stream. In fact, we're in this moment that has phenomenal, it's just sort of boundless. The past is here and the future is here in this present moment. And, disavowing the past, I think, is blindness. It's kind of like, when you ask, what was your grandmother's name? You can probably, most of us remember that. Your great-grandmother's name, your great-great-grandmother's name. So the ancestral stream has been forgotten by most of us. And a sense of the future is also something we live, many people in our culture live as if in a kind of sense of irresponsibility, as if, 7 generations hence it's not going to make any difference to me. But how about our offspring and their offspring? What are we leaving for them? So, that sense of past and present in the present and future in the present, I think is something that also helps us to generate not only an ethical base with regards to the consequentiality of our actions now, but a deep sense of gratitude for the past.
Well, actually, getting on that topic, Deepak Chopra has a new book coming out called Saving Faith. And it's his response to militant atheists. But it's a very interesting book. But one of the concepts is you were talking about this idea that, there's a future, you want to live something forward, you want to be thoughtful about that. And one of the things I've talked about is this desire to be connected with something greater than yourself. And it seems to be this very innate desire for almost all of us to have a sense that we were here for a reason, that there's a purpose, that our actions today and throughout our lives have had some meaning that will extend beyond ourselves. And is that what you're talking about when you were, or?
Well, maybe yes, but maybe no.
This bad karma, good karma?
Well,
or is that, would you say that's an ego-driven response?
I would, humbly suggest that wanting to leave a legacy is a nice idea, but it has a few little gnarls in it.
I didn't say leave a legacy.
But that's,
What I said was to have a sense that your actions in your life had a purpose.
Well, yes and no. We're going back. I mean, we're going to it's like sort of parsing this in a funny way. From, I think, one point of view, what's been called the narrative self wants to be satisfied. That is a sense of meaning, purpose, direction, also that we've lived a good life. I have to say, in working with dying people, it is even people whose lives have not been so exemplary. One of the things that one endeavors to do in an interaction with somebody who's maybe not had the most positive life is to invite them to look more deeply at aspects of their life where they have been a resource, where they have benefited others. If you're just going to end up dwelling in, the sort of list of sins or omissions, that's a pretty difficult situation to attend to when you're nearing the end of your life. But also, I think that we're in this very interesting paradox. It's really fascinating, and I know that, Ken and Gary are aware of this. We derive a lot of joy out of doing good, out of not only not harming, but actually of being a beneficial presence in the world. And this is your work. This is what CCARE is about. This is what UPI is about. This is what our practice is about, is the sense of joy and the narrative self being fulfilled because I'm not a hazard on the road of life. I actually am, contributing in a positive way. So I think that valence is really important. But there's another valence which is paradoxical, which also, when you're in the field that, the end-of-life care field, looking at Gary and Ken sitting in front of me, and also working in the prison system, all the guys that I worked with had murdered people, most of them multiple people. They were going to be there the rest of their life. There was just no question. The system was not going to let these men out into society. They're really difficult cookies. It was really a very rough crowd. And I never knew, Jim, when I walked into the prison, I never knew if my presence, which I went in 3 times a week for 6 years, made any difference at all. But what was important to do was just show up. Just be there. And that's very much in the process that, or a process that we engender in our Buddhist practice, and that is, from another point of view, not being attached to outcome, not going for an outcome. And and by the way, I think that is one of the prerequisites at the cognitive level for compassion to unfold. If you're doing your compassion, so to speak, or actualizing compassion from the point of view of trying to get something, this is one side of the coin, like produce a good death in your patient. From another point of view, you're going to do your best to benefit. But the opposite is also true. And it has to do with dissolving futility. Because you know in this work, you know working with those kids who were dying, those who died, if you weren't able to hold a kind of bigger space, you would never go into the PICU again. You'd never go into the pediatric intensive care unit again. It would be too heartbreaking. You would feel such profound futility because even with all your skills as a clinician, you weren't able to save those children's lives.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think you have to develop a different viewpoint, which is exactly as you said, which is acceptance, if you want to call it futility, but still have an open heart and still show up and have presence.
I'm not saying acceptance or futility. I'm saying the negative outcome is futility if really bad things happen and you've had an outcome in front of you. What I'm saying is that you have another place inside of you which is not attached to the outcome, where you're not driving for an outcome, but you are in that place where you accept whatever is given.
No, and maybe I'm even missing it, but it's being present without attachment to any of the other aspects. All you're doing is the best you can do.
Exactly.
That's all each of us can do, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'd like to think about Jim's work. I mean, can you imagine, going into the human brain in the way that you do as a neurosurgeon? It's just...
She's trained. She told me she was going to change this conversation to talk about me. It's a neat shift, but I caught it. It's interesting you say that because, on the one hand, you see me sort of break up here and get emotional, which my wife says at a Lassie movie, I'll do that. So I can't help that. But
how about Black Beauty? Boy, that killed me.
Exactly. But what's interesting is because it is an amazing paradox. On the one hand, to do what I do, I have to absolutely objectify the situation and turn it into an absolute technical exercise without any thought. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in some ways, it's almost like a meditative practice. And you have to get into a complete place in your head where you can't have their humanity face you because it's incredibly painful, the thought of what might happen. Right? Mm-hmm. So you have to turn it strictly into a technical exercise. And in fact, I think the only situation that I can recall where I had difficulty actually was a woman who presented to me with headaches, and she had had an MRI done, and she had a brain aneurysm that was about 2 centimeters in size, which is very large, and it was next to her speech area. And the one thing she loved in her life was opera singing. And because this was on some level elective surgery, she'd gone to see different people, and she said, I want you to do this. But in the course of 3 or 4 visits, I had become to like her and a great deal as a human being. And so I operated on her. And in the surgery, I exposed this aneurysm. And if you know what happens with aneurysms, as they grow, the wall gets thinner and thinner until it ruptures. And as I exposed this aneurysm, the wall was so thin you could see the blood swirling, which meant it was about to explode, and thank goodness we had operated on it. But as I was watching that, and I had the aneurysm clip in my hand, I had it fully exposed, ready to put the clip at the base to treat the woman, I started thinking about her. And thinking about, geez, what if she gets a clot here? What if the clip isn't positioned correctly? What if, and then sure, she said, I live for my opera singing. And my hand started shaking. I mean, to the point where I'm like, which is, you don't want that to happen to your neurosurgeon. Okay. So what so what I did was, I actually stopped. I sat down for 10 minutes and went back into the space to separate that again, and I was successfully able to do that, and she had a perfect operation and outcome, and she's still a friend of mine. Thank God. Yeah, it tells you, and this is, I think, hard for us to deal with these emotional situations. Now, the challenge, I think, for doctors is on the one hand, it is asked of us, and our challenge is to be compassionate and to care and to be sensitive and thoughtful. But on the other hand, you can see this situation where, on some level, you have to turn it all off and turn it into, if you will, just a exercise you do over and over. And the horrible thing, as a physician, that I see, and maybe you can comment from your own experiences, sometimes doctors turn it off too much. They're not there for you. They're not even listening to you. You have actually become just case number 324, not Mabel, who has a husband and children. And I think that's, at least for me, oftentimes, the thing that you have to reiterate to yourself, because, we're not given enough time. These are complex problems. I will tell you, and I give a talk sometimes, and I say, science and technology are wonderful. They've had a huge impact in the field of medicine and a variety of other fields. But in your work, the transition of somebody dying, in the context of a child who's in pain, all the science and technology in the world is not going to help that.
Yeah. What a great guy, huh? Yeah, really. And there's some wonderful clinicians down here on row 2 who are good friends of mine who exemplify these qualities. Jim, I have this sort of meditation process that is the first kind of process I introduced in the work that Gary and I and other clinicians teach at Upaya. And it uses the image of strong back, soft front, the relationship between compassion and equanimity. And I make a little point, which is that most of us are strong front, soft back. We're very defended. We're hiding behind our roles. We've kind of hardened up in the front of our body, and our back is really soft. We're really fear-driven. And that what practice endeavors to do is to actually shift that dynamic. That's one thing that I think is really critical for clinicians, is to, first of all, just to get on to compassion, I want to exorcise or to excise the term compassion fatigue from our vocabulary. It really, from the research, and Erica is very aware of, I see that head nodding, compassion doesn't fatigue us. When you begin to look at compassion in a more, or understand that process in a more granular way, that what is exhausting us is affective over-arousal or empathic over-arousal, empathic distress. And it's very true that there's clinicians suffer from compassion deficit. And that is damaging to clinicians. And I love what you did in that process with your friend, whose brain was in your hands. You did something that we actually train clinicians to do. which is an intervention that really derived from this work that I did at the Library of Congress. I was this distinguished visiting scholar there, so it was great. I had my own office at the library, just this phenomenal building, just the most extraordinary facilities available to me. And I didn't have to do anything but sit in my office and think. I didn't have to travel. I didn't have to administrate. I didn't have to take care of students. I just sat and thought. And in that process, Jim, I read a lot of neuroscience literature. I reflected on my years of friendship with Francisco Varela, who was very much a systems thinker. I thought about my years of meditation practice. I thought about my own experience of being in situations that are characterized by extreme suffering. And I thought about the many clinicians that I've worked with over the years and what their experience has been from my limited perspective. And one day it was like a kind of big flash in the bright sky, and it was, I realized you couldn't train people in compassion. And it was, there's this whole idea that you can train people how to be compassionate. But I suddenly realized you couldn't. That in actuality, what's happening in Buddhism, we sort of jump to the end, that is compassion. But there's something that's preceding compassion in terms of the training process that we as Buddhists engage in. And it's very interesting what you did, because it relates to, what I began to unpack in this examination of compassion, which is not well understood in the West. And that was, I realized that compassion is actually comprised of non-compassion elements. And that what we train in fact, in order to prime compassion, are these non-compassion elements, which are in a dynamical interaction with each other, and that give rise to compassion in a nonlinear way. And I looked at it, I had that sort of fiat, and then I began to sort of unpack it, and I realized, well, it's actually not so complicated, and it's basically what you did. We train in our practice in the cultivation of attention, attentional balance, so that our capacity to attend things, whether it's focused attention or open presence, is characterized by a series of, or sets of qualities which include high resolution or vividness, the ability to have an attentional field that's fundamentally stable so we can perceive things accurately, the ability to actually hold our attention or lend our attention for more than a moment in a world that is where attention is divided and dispersed, where we can bring our attention or lend our attention. I don't like pay attention. Lend our attention or give our attention to our patient or to you for more than a mind moment. So attentional balance is really critical, and there was another factor, and that also affects attention. And this is Rebecca Todd's work and Adam's work, Barbara Fredrickson, and I talked to Erica about this because she sent me a pre-pub on her research, and I said, well, there's a few things. Affect biases our attention. So, in Barbara Fredrickson's work and also Rebecca's and so on, what we're seeing is that our capacity in the direction of prosociality, of really caring about people, affects our ability to actually lend our attention. And so prosocial affect on the level of its interaction with attention, but also in genuinely caring about people. and caring about the world, caring about your dog, caring about the future. All of this is really important and plays a part in the development of the capacity for compassion, but it's not compassion yet. So these are two dimensions which are really critical. I also realized that the cognitive dimension was really important. That the cognitive dimension had two valences that I found to be critical. First was the intention of the individual. In other words, our motivation or the ethical baseline, that it really makes a difference at the level of affect, but also ethics, that we care about the world. And from the Buddhist point of view, the sort of Mahayana, excuse me for being sectarian for a minute, but we have all of these cues in our Buddhist ritual life and our cognitive life that point toward altruism. We say, you know, I vow to attain enlightenment in order to save all beings from suffering. We do that at the beginning. Then we dedicate the merit at the end. We do all kinds of things of this nature. That the ethical base, or our intention, our deep aspiration to awaken, is based on a process that's basically grounded in a deeply ethical perspective. And then there's the second part of the cognitive stream, and I can go on about this a lot, but just briefly, and that is insight. Our ability to discern clearly the nature of reality, to be able to have a metacognitive perspective, to have a self-awareness, so we're able, when we're going off the tracks or off the wagon, to self-regulate, to distinguish self from other, to see into the truth of impermanence or all beings. Whether the guy is in prison for raping a 7-year-old girl and then killing her, and that's one of the people I worked intensively with, who, by the way, called off his appeal and was the first person to be executed in New Mexico in 40 years. Very heavy scene. But you're in this process with people where you begin to see, even though people are deluded, basically they want to be happy. And this last cognitive stream that we were just talking about, this ability to not be attached to the outcome. So that's the sort of second stream, the cognitive stream. And by the way, these streams are not valued or weighted. Each of the streams are really of equal value. And the third one that I want to mention, this is nonlinear, by the way, and I did it in a Venn diagram, just to, you'll see in the paper that I did for the Max Planck volume on compassion. The third stream is the embodiment stream. And I have to tell you, Tanya was the person who just lit my fire around this. I kind of knew it, but I didn't know why. And this started a whole kind of set of deliberations, Jim, that around embodiment and compassion that have, had me sort of pushing into a new field. And that is at a meeting in Ann Arbor with His Holiness, a small meeting, about a dozen of us, including Richie and Amishi Jha, Richie Davidson and Amishi Jha. Mathieu was there, Joseph Goldstein, and so on. We're all sitting with His Holiness and exploring issues about, what are the important research questions, particularly in relation to compassion. And Tanya Singer was there, who is the head of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. And she's such a pistol. She's so,
I was just with her in Mungod.
She's just incredible. And she said, well, I want to tell you. And she's off on this tear. It really got my attention. And she cited some work that she had done with people who have alexithymia, which is an autism-related disorder. And what she noticed, which was really interesting, it's well known, people who have alexithymia have, very low capacity for empathy. But something else is kind of low that's really, really caught my attention. And that is that they have a very diminished capacity for what's termed as interoceptivity, the ability to read one's visceral processes. And that very similar neural pathways are activated, both in being interoceptive, you're reading, sensing into your own visceral experience, as when you're sensing into the experience of another. And it was like a little light went up. Woo! And I thought of all the clinicians, the nurses and doctors and hospice workers and social workers that I've been working with over the years who have a very dissociated relationship with the body and who also are suffering from this sense of alienation or lack of compassion.
Do you think, is this a fear response that they've created to stop pain?
Well, this goes into the work of Daniel Batson and particularly Nancy Eisenberg. And what Eisenberg did was, in working with kids, she saw that to have compassion, you have to have a certain level of arousal. You just can't be in a state of absolute equanimity or like a kind of psychological technician. You got to feel something. But when the arousal level is not regulated, either volitionally or it occurs spontaneously, then individuals go into what Batson called personal distress. And then both Batson and Eisenberg describe two pathways in this, and they're important pathways for clinicians to know about. One of those pathways is a pathway that leads to what Eisenberg has called selfish prosocial behavior. Is that funny? It seems paradoxical. What's selfish prosocial behavior? But it is, for example, let's just take when you were talking about your kids and you had tears.
I didn't have any tears.
Yes, you did. You did too. When you were in that sort of upwelling, if I had taken the Kleenex and said, here,
You did.
I would have cut you off at the pass. But what I did was and I didn't think about it, but in retrospect, the upwelling happened. There was a kind of breath, there was a sort of shift in your psyche, and that's when I pulled the Kleenex, and I didn't hand it to you, I put it there. So if you wanted to pick it up, you could, but I wasn't handling your experience, so to speak. I wasn't cutting you off. So,
I was hoping you would. That's what
I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate
I'm sorry I didn't meet your expectations. Well, never mind. So the other trajectory, Jim, is that Eisenberg articulates, and actually my associate Cinda Rushton and I kind of took it a little further, and that has to do with three responses related to fear. And the three typical fear responses are fight, flight, and freeze. Yeah. And we looked at how this actualizes in the clinical setting. And so, and this was a discourse that she and I had over a number of years, but particularly around a case that we were working on of a group of clinicians in the CICU at Hopkins, the cardiac intensive care unit, where a cardiac surgeon, had done a heart transplant on a fairly young male patient where it wasn't a good match. And this guy was in the CICU at Hopkins 9 months. Now that's unheard of. You kind of get into the ICU and get them out. 9 months in the CICU with a cascade of horrendous symptoms, which necessitated multiple amputations, all kinds of decubitus ulcers, just a horrendous thing, ending with the patient's death. But also the outcome was that the interprofessional team went into all three: moral outrage, completely enraged at the cardiologist who kept, or the cardiac surgeon, heart surgeon, because of, one intervention after another.
He would not give up.
He would not give up, and the nurses were just done. They were in a chronic moral dilemma. The second is the patient was suffering so much, they began to avoid the patient, and some of them even abandoned caring for the patient. Therefore, decubitus ulcers. They felt incredibly guilty about that. And the last symptom is freeze. They were in freeze. They were just absolutely, the first time that we went in to consult with the team, they were just frozen. But they also had the other two processes engaged. All out of this issue of, upstream, not really being able to work with the level of arousal, and then the cascade of effects. You, on the other hand, did the opposite. You did what we call practicing grace, and I'll tell you what grace is. This is a little mnemonic that I devised out of this model work, compassion model work. You practiced grace before you messed up your patient, which was you stepped back and you gathered your attention. You remembered really why you were there, which was to serve unconditionally this patient. You attuned to yourself. You weren't just out there with your patient operating on automatic. You actually checked in with yourself. You saw what your somatic response was, your affective content, and your cognitive stream. And then you gave yourself over to your patient and attuned into your patient. What is really going to serve was the next inquiry, feeling into your patient's situation, and then you engaged. And that's G is gathering your attention, R is recalling your intention, A is attuning first to self, put your oxygen mask on yourself before your kid, attuning to the other, C is considering really what will serve, and then engaging, practicing grace.
See, and I didn't even read that. That article didn't even exist at that time. And I think, though, this is a very good point, because this example you gave, you have to ask yourself, what was the driver of that doctor, right?
Yeah.
And I will tell you, I get engaged in this conversation where this becomes an ego-driven activity by the doctor, not a caring, thoughtful interaction with a human being who that should be the center of your attention. Yeah. It becomes about you and showing to everybody you're not going to give up and you're tough and you never fail and you'll do everything. And again, in my own experience, I've run across this innumerable times. In fact, I have a doctor right now who says he won't refer to me. And here's the situation. He's a hematology oncology doctor. And he's one of these, he will do every drug. The patient will say, please, I can't do this anymore. I'm in horrible pain. Stop. He'll go, no, we're going to do this. Give this one more time. I mean, just absolutely not listening to the patient. Because, the reality is, if you listen, most people will tell you what they want or what they need. But you have to listen, right? And I can't tell you the number of times he would refer me patients who literally had weeks to live. I mean, you cannot, if somebody has widely metastatic disease that's in every organ of their body, has failed 3 rounds of every type of chemotherapy, they're going to die. And they would come and see me and say, well, Dr. So-and-so sent me to you, and I have this tumor on my spine, and he wants to know if you'll take it out. And you're like, what planet? I go, well, did he talk to you about planning for the future? He says, well, he goes, once you operate on me, I'll be able to go back to work. And you're going like, and you put in this horrible position. What are you going to do? Are you going to, you now become the person who tells them they're going to die, or at least starts making them think about this? And, I'm in this very horrible position. Yeah, well, and I would be. And then he said, I'll never refer to you because I want my patients to not be fearful. I want them to have hope. And I've said, there's a difference between hope and reality. And you have to, again, put this in the context of a realistic expectation, because people need time to come to grips with these issues. And if you don't put them in a position where they have the process, it makes this transition a horrible situation for all involved, because suddenly they wake up and it's like they're going into the ICU and they're going, well, but I thought I was going to be cured. And it's really a horrible, horrible position to be in.
And it's also a really extraordinary position to be in. To create as I know Ken and Gary do, the feeling of respect and trust, and I'm sure you do the same, where the truth of our mortality is revealed in the context of the interaction with somebody who has come to terms with that himself or herself. And I think that's in part what our practice is about. This is what our work is about, is what the spiritual path is about. And that is recognizing that this precious human life is an opportunity for us to benefit many beings or really mess up. And that also the truth of our mortality gives us a sense of deep appreciation for this moment right here. This is it. And instead of being entitled or taking for granted or feeling ungrateful or being in the victim mode and just complaining, there's this sort of robustness that arises, which the great teachers have actualized, of this very moment is a treasure house. This is it. And that comes about, I believe, in coming to the realization that you are going to die, I'm going to die, everything will pass from us.
No, I think that is a challenge for all of us, and it's our evolution has put us in this unique position where, again, as we were talking about earlier, we're pulled to the uncertainty of the future, the events that happened in the past, instead of being ecstatic about being right here at this moment, and whether that moment is actual death, to be ecstatic about that moment.
And the mystery of death, I have to say, I'm not a transcendently oriented person. I'm not a person who is into, the sort of super romance or mystery of anything. But I loved how our colleague Francisco Varela approached his own dying and his death. And that was a real sense of not knowing, an appreciation that it could be the end or it could be the opportunity for complete awakening. And holding ourselves open to that possibility, I think, is a very powerful way to approach something that most of us, I would probably say everybody in this room, including me and probably you, we can't know. We can't say anything for sure, but the possibility is there for awakening at the moment of death if we have primed the conditions.
At least in my own experience, and again, as I've acknowledged, when I have a patient who's in that situation or going through that experience, I don't run away. In fact, I try to engage even more, because oftentimes that's actually when they need you more, right? But one of the things that I've found a challenge for myself sometimes, and you alluded to it in some ways when you're talking about sometimes nasty people are going through this situation, or they're people who don't want to leave. And it's a very interesting experience because the event is happening regardless of what they want, yet they're grasping so difficult. And it's actually, I find it sometimes traumatizing for me, because I'm trying to be there for them, yet it's as if, they're drowning and they're grabbing on, but it's going to happen, right? And it's,
Well, that's part of the work. And I feel my good friend and teacher, Bernie Glassman, has something he calls the 3 tenets. And the first tenet is the tenet of not knowing. You just don't know. And you live in that kind of sort of stupidity. I mean, you really don't know. And the second is that of bearing witness. Sometimes, it's like when I was working with Terry Clark, this prisoner on death row. It was I wanted something for him that he, in this lifetime, didn't want for himself. So I had to hold that. I had to be with it. And I had to reconcile myself with the truth of this was his choice to call off the appeal. In spite of the fact that I felt that my colleague and I were giving him a kind of unconditional regard, regardless of the crime that he had committed. And he was put to death, as it turned out. And so that bearing witness, when we go to, I went to Auschwitz twice with Bernie, and you're sitting on the selection side on the tracks, 150 people, saying the names of those who have died in the camps. And you bear witness not only to your response of, just horror and futility and helplessness, but, to the situation that your aspiration is that it never happens again in the future. So bearing witness is really, you invite, as we say, all hungry spirits into the mandala of your practice. And that's what you do as a physician and as a human. It's what I think everybody here, we understand, that kind of radical inclusivity. And out of that, compassionate action can arise from that base. Sometimes.
sometimes not.
You do the best you can, as you said.
Yes. One of the things we didn't mention, which I think that was part and parcel, is this idea of self-compassion, where you have to care and nurture for yourself and be kind to yourself, and because that facilitates, I think, being compassionate. And then the other aspect is, somebody described you as, what was it? Fearless and fragile, and let's say vulnerability. Being vulnerable to the events that are, I think, happening, and acceptance and allowing yourself to be there.
I think he's fearless and fragile too, don't you? Yeah.
What is my wife is Russian, and she's taught my children this who speak Russian. So there's this term of endearment called, I shouldn't be telling this because this is going to be out there, I guess, but there's this term called tolstinky, and it means the puffy one. And I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I think it's a term of endearment and being... yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. I know some other terms, which I know exactly what those mean in Russian. But the point is, yes, you're fragile and you're sensitive, and you're apparently puffy, too. On that note, it's a wonderful conversation.
Oh, Jim, thank you
Yes.
so much, really.
And it's really a blessing. We're going to open the floor to questions or comments to all of you Tolstinkies out there. There are microphones on either side. I know there have to be some burning questions, and it's not always that we're, or our guest or myself are able to answer them, but at least we give it a good shot. Yes, young lady.
Having witnessed people's dying process and having been so intimately involved with that and having been a long-term meditator, I imagine that you've had very deep experiences yourself, perhaps, with consciousness. Last year there was a neurosurgeon who described having had meningitis and having had an experience of consciousness himself. And so I'm wondering if you feel comfortable sharing any of your own personal experiences with that.
Well, I need you to go back to the mic because I don't quite understand your question.
Well, you've witnessed people transitioning
Yeah.
and been there, I'm sure, very deeply engaged in that in ways that many people may not be able to do because of your own experiences in meditation, your own ability to be present. And I know people who've had near-death experiences or experiences as this neurosurgeon did of consciousness, they have an experience of what that has been for them. And I'm wondering if somehow in the course of witnessing people transitioning you've had, or your own deep, again, experiences of meditation, you have any thoughts about that or experiences that you might feel comfortable sharing with us?
You know, in a funny way, my meditation practice is like brown rice without any tamari on it. You know, it's very plain rice. I mean, for me, the point of my practice has gotten simpler and simpler over the years. It's not been so much about connecting with the transcendent function, but it used to be. You know, altered states were, you know, very interesting to me at one point, as some of you might know from my background. But as I've aged, reality has become more relevant. And even though I have witnessed individuals going through this transition, as Gary and Ken have, in the, you know, shift from in the process of active dying, and then at the death point, which is really in a way different for every individual. My practice, as it's matured or regressed, I'm not sure which, has been more about plainness, or not attributing transcendence, but just holding things or being with things, or being with the person as he or she is. You know, I again, you know, my past with being married to Stanislav Grof, my only marriage, you know, and doing the LSD work at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, and being an anthropologist and working in indigenous cultures where altered states were really valued. You know, it's not that I'm here to reject those extraordinary states, but I have kind of gotten to a place, you know, as an older person, this is the most extraordinary state, right? You know, right here in this moment. So it's like I'm not seeking it to be anything other than what it is right here. Oh.
Just to comment to that person, it's interesting, this book by Eben Alexander, I think Kevin's for Real, I think that's the name of it. So I peripherally know Eben, but obviously I'm a neurosurgeon too, and I had a near-death experience. When I was in my training, a dear friend of mine ran us into a tree after he lost control on a slippery highway at about 45 miles an hour, and I was the only one wearing a seatbelt, and I had a transected small bowel, a fractured spleen, a spine fracture. And I went to emergency surgery, and then after the surgery, the chief of surgery actually missed a bleeder. And what happened was, here I am in the ICU, and these people are arguing at my bed, the vice chairman of neurosurgery and the chief of surgery, because my blood pressure is dropping precipitously, and the chief of surgery refuses to admit that he could possibly have missed a bleeder in my belly. And now my pressure is 40/0, and I'm ventilating, so the blood, to get your blood pressure in a guy my size to 40/0, you've lost about 4 liters of blood. Okay. Well, if I'm breathing and I don't have these swollen limbs, it can only be in one place, which is your belly, right? I mean, so he refused to believe it, and my chairman got to an argument with him. And during this point, I left my body. And in fact, I was sitting up in the corner of this, watching the two of them argue. And I couldn't verbally speak, but I'm going, "You idiots, I'm going to die," right? And my vice chairman said, he used a profanity, but he said, "If you don't take him back, so-and-so, I'm going to take him back." And the chief of surgery took me back. And in fact, I had 5 liters of blood in my belly. And by the time they got me to the OR, I had no blood pressure. And then during this part of it, I then suddenly was in a situation where I was going down nominally a stream, and there's this bright light at the end. And this is what is a classic near-death experience. And it's going down this river. We were going faster and faster. And you start hearing these voices of loved ones or people who've died, who you've cared about in your life. And in fact, your life is playing before you. And as you're going down this, you get this incredible warmth and desire to touch this light and be with this light, because this light has this immense warmth. And you can tell that you're being embraced by this immense love. And at least for me, this experience, you're going down this river and you're going even faster now. And at some point I said, "I'm not done here yet. I'm not going to do this." And suddenly my voyage stops. And the next thing I know, I'm in the recovery room. And I survived, and I guess I didn't transcend. So I tell this story, and all these people want me to tell you that this had some huge impact on my life. It changed me forever. I embraced the light, and I'm oneness with all. And it didn't happen. I didn't have the angels. I don't believe in angels. But what I have chalked this to is an extraordinary experience. Do I know what it means? I have no clue. But it was certainly an interesting experience, and at least for the moment, one I'd rather not relive again, at least in the near term. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. I did recover, obviously.
Jim, I would question the statement that it had no impact. Really? Nah.
Oh, because of how I am today?
Yeah.
No, that did not have an impact. I was this way before then, I will tell you.
Okay, whatever you say, dear. What is that?
Okay, I saw the light. Okay, everybody?
So stinky?
It's nice to be in front of two amazing people. Joan, we have a question for you. Some of us who are in the CCARE program, we refer to your paper multiple times because of the simplicity of that diagram, the 3 dimensions, how all of these co-emerge and compassion comes out of all these 3 dimensions together with many other things like equanimity and loving kindness. Could you explain how you came up with it? It's so simple and eloquent. We want to use it everywhere. But I can't imagine how you came up with it.
Well, it really is simple, but it just makes perfect sense. But, what I did was I looked at my own experience. And I began to unpack it. And I thought, there's no compassion without attentional balance. There's no compassion without affective balance. There's no compassion without intention, which is unselfish. There's no compassion without a series of cognitive elements. And there's no compassion without embodiment. And, as soon as I played the orchestra in that way, it made, I had to do it in a certain way reductionistically or go at it backwards. And as soon as I did that, it was just a thought experiment that I, after digesting, really examining my own experience, looking at the literature and just sitting there with this sort of garble and tangle. And then I did a thought experiment, and it was perfectly clear, at least to me, nobody else might agree except for you, and I think Erica agrees, it is elegant. It's a very simple way of looking at something that I feel has not been adequately understood, and I think it will have a very significant impact on how we train people in this field. We're going to train them in attention and not compassion. We're going to train them in pro-social affect, not compassion. We're going to train people in, sort of a Vipassana or insight process of strong ethical base and embodiment. And then compassion emerges in the alchemy when these streams encounter each other. And thank you.
Yes, young lady.
Thank you so much. This has been really nurturing and fascinating. Thank you for being here, Joan. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one, which is I've found that one of the biggest obstacles to compassion for me is criticism and judgment, especially of myself, but also of really anything, any situation or any person. And at kind of a deeper level, it's a feeling of worthlessness or no value. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions or practices to work with that energy of criticism.
One, it has to do with, this is a long conversation about, the sense of an inherent self, and I'm not going to go off on that tear, which is, one of our favorite Buddhist things to do.
We have all night.
No, we don't. We're over the time, Jim. One of the, I think the most interesting processes has to do with developing the capacity to have a metacognitive perspective. So you can look at your self-condemnation, cynicism, skepticism, self-disgust, and so forth, and to engage actively in a reappraisal process, knowing that the negative appraisal is based on something that is actually a fabrication. And you begin to learn how to reappraise things. And reappraisal is really an essential process, for particularly sort of heady, Western, skeptical, cynical, self-centered people, which populates our society. And this is, and it's catastrophic thinking, that plagues our culture. It's characterizing the whole world as a sort of terror cell. And it's, we have to really reappraise things. And part of it is, from the point of view of Buddhism, pardon me for my sectarian moment at the end of this evening, but we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. So the Buddha, you can say historical, but I like to see it another way. I like to take refuge in each individual's capacity for goodness. So I'm sitting in front of a guy who murdered a bunch of kids, and I don't take refuge in the murderer. I take refuge in the wounded Buddha in front of me. And it's just a different, system. It's really kind of interesting. Because I know if I'm sitting with a person in intractable pain and I just hold them as only their pain, that's not holding them in arms that are big enough.
I would just make a couple comments. One is, there's an immense amount of work by Kristen Neff on self-compassion and practices, which sort of help with this self-criticism. There's the work of Paul Gilbert, who's actually going to be here in the next couple of weeks. And I'll tell you from my own experience, briefly, and then we'll stop because I know but, I have mentioned this. I grew up in a great deal of pain in my own family situation, and I won't bore you with all the aspects of that, but it's very painful. And especially when you're young, you take on this burden of pain, and you're self-critical because you have a tendency to say, well, this happened because of me, right? And then you start saying, I'm not worthy. You have shame issues. You have deep pain. And, how do you get through that so that you can sort of become a transformed or a person who's change their perception. And one of the things that I've shared with others, and some of you know, is for me that experience happened with a chance encounter, actually, in a magic shop with a woman who was the owner's mother. And she knew nothing about magic from the magic shop. But I went in, there's a 13-year-old who was vulnerable and damaged and hurt and in pain. And this woman may have been also what the term was I using, activist or whatever from the 60s. She was this sort of earth mother who was big smile and embracing. And she chatted with me and she said, you know, if you come here every day for the next 6 weeks, I'll teach you something that will change your life. And it was actually a mindfulness meditation practice with the visualization technique. And what that allowed me to do was actually to change my perception. Not to no longer be that person who is wounded and is self-critical, who has no possibilities, but to transform it into looking at it from a different place, to recognize you have endless possibilities within you. And suddenly, when you see that different world, it's like, you know, the curtain is lifted and there's this incredible brightness about life. And that exists, I think, for all of us. And this was actually my own first personal experience with, if you will, neuroplasticity and changing your brain. And I think you have that available.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
Jim.